He was implicated in a case of missing money from a courthouse evidence vault. There were allegations of misconduct and illegal handling of a witness in a major drug trafficking trial, which led to the judge ordering a federal investigation. One way to stop that federal investigation would be to come up with a quick plea deal to end the case. One problem: there was no way to do the plea deal without violating federal law. And unfortunately, for US Assistant Attorney Jonathan Luna, this wasn't even the worst of it. Not even close. Out of the housing projects in the South Bronx, New York City, described as some of the poorest neighbourhoods in the country, came Jonathan Luna. Despite the non-stop violence, shootings, gangs and drugs that he grew up around, Jonathan somehow managed to avoid it all and become a bright, well-read student. Reading and learning to better himself was Jonathan's drug of choice. He dedicated himself to school, saying that to be successful, you had to be educated. In high school, he also developed the love of running and keeping fit. If he wasn't studying, he was running. Through his own hard work and determination, Jonathan Luna overcame the poverty-stricken, drug-ridden, violent housing projects he was brought up in and went off to college. He was later accepted into the University of North Carolina School of Law. In 1992, he graduated from law school and won a clerkship with a US District Judge in Greensboro, North Carolina. Soon after, he would go on to be hired as an associate at Arnold & Porter, a law firm in Washington, D.C. He then married the love of his life, Angela, in 1993. From 94 to 97, he worked as a staff attorney in the Federal Trade Commission counsel's office. But he felt a calling towards prosecution, and in 1997, he took the assistant district attorney's job in Brooklyn. Then, in 1999, he was hired as the Assistant US Attorney in Maryland, a federal prosecutor. When he won this job, he and his wife moved to Baltimore, where the US Attorney's office was located. Baltimore at the time was a city with a population of about 650,000 people. It's estimated that about 10% of that population were addicted to either crack or heroin. On average, the city had over 200 murders each year. It was a tough, violent city with a large drug problem. There was also widespread allegations from residents of corruption amongst the police and other city officials. Assistant US Attorney Jonathan Luna handled tough cases. He prosecuted drug dealers, bank robbers, pedophiles, murderers. But it was the investigation of two drug traffickers, Dion Smith and Walter Poindexter, and the star witness against them, Warren Grace, where we begin this bizarre story. At 21 years of age, Warren Grace had already served 5 years in prison on heroin and gun charges. It just so happened that he was selling drugs for Walter Poindexter when he was caught. Walter liked Warren and made sure he was as comfortable as possible when he was in prison. He visited him regularly and was always sending him money. And when Warren was eventually released from prison, he went to live with Walter. And it didn't take long for him to get straight back into the drug trade. Walter Poindexter was a street-level dealer. He had various runners working a corner for him, his main man being Warren Grace. But Walter had to source his drugs from somewhere too. And that's where Dion Smith comes in. Dion Smith was an independent rap music producer and an aspiring rapper himself. He was also a mid-level supplier of heroin. He had access to the higher-level dealers, the organised crime gangs in New York. Dion would get his drugs from New York, Walter would then buy the drugs from Dion, which then he would on-sell to the street. On a bad day, Walter and Warren would make $1,000 to $1,500, but that was a bad day. Good days could be anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000. And of course, the best days of trade were the 2 days of the month that government assistance checks were issued. Despite business being good, Walter Poindexter kept getting himself arrested. No major drug supply charges yet, but enough to keep him out of action for a little while. In a way, this was good news for Warren, because in Walter's absence, it meant he got to run the corner and make more money. That is, until Warren himself came unstuck and got arrested. On April 7th, 2002, Baltimore police raided his house to find scales, heroin, and 2 guns. He was also charged with aiding and abetting. This was bad news for Warren. Very bad news. Given his history and what he had just been caught with, he faced at least 40 years in prison, 30 without the possibility of parole. He was facing the very real possibility that he wouldn't see the streets again until he was in his mid-50s. That wasn't a very exciting prospect for Warren, but he'd been keeping an ace up his sleeve in case he ever found himself in a bad position such as this. He had information about the murder of Alvin Jones, a murder committed by his good friend Walter Poindexter. In 2001, before Walter was arrested, one of his drug houses was robbed. Word got back to him that Alvin Jones was the man responsible. Walter's retaliation was swift and brutal. He filled him full of bullets. So not only was it a murder, it was a drug-related murder, meaning Walter Poindexter would go to prison without the chance of ever getting out and could even face a death penalty. Not only was Warren Grace happy to give up his friend for murder, he was also more than happy to talk to the police about the drug syndicate he was a part of. Baltimore police contacted the FBI and they couldn't resist the opportunity, locking up a rap music producer for drug supply and clearing a drug-related shooting. They were in. The FBI agent in charge of the case was Agent Steve Skinner from the Baltimore field office. He quickly filled in Assistant US Attorney Jonathan Luna about what they had. Luna quickly arranged for Warren to be brought into his office along with Agent Skinner to discuss what he knew. Warren knew how it worked. He had information, but that information wasn't going to be for free. So in order to show just how cooperative they were willing to be, Luna dropped the aiding and abetting charge that Warren was facing. And just like that, his 40-year term dropped down to 30. But that was just the beginning. If he worked with the government, cooperated with the FBI, and testified truthfully, he would be granted further reductions in sentencing. The FBI took over the case and filed Warren's charges in a federal court where they had control. On May 31st, 2002, Warren pled guilty to the gun and drug charges and he was released to a halfway house to work undercover with Agent Skinner and the FBI whilst he was awaiting his sentencing. How well the case was built against Smith and Poindexter and how well he testified would ultimately lead to a greater reduced sentence. And he even got paid for his trouble. As part of the deal, Warren Grace had to agree not to use a firearm, not to use drugs, and not to leave the halfway house without the approval of the FBI. He also had to wear a monitoring device. It didn't take Warren long to break every one of those rules. In fact, he would go right back to drug dealing and to shooting up the neighbourhood. He even removed his monitoring device at times. Agent Skinner effectively turned a blind eye to all of this, and even took active steps to ensure Warren's release wasn't revoked. He knew what he was up to, but he left him out on the street putting the community at risk anyway. He just wanted him to get to Poindexter and Smith. That's all he cared about. Warren Grace was basically free to do what he wanted with the blessing of Agent Skinner. To build their case, the FBI wired Warren up and recorded his conversations with Dion Smith. They got plenty of conversations nailing Smith for drug trafficking. And it wasn't long before Walter Poindexter was released from his current sentence either. And they got plenty of incriminating evidence against him on tape too, thanks to Warren. The FBI would also conduct surveillance and observe some drug transactions taking place. They gave Warren money to buy the drugs, the deal was recorded, then he would hand the drugs over to the FBI to be entered up as evidence. Whilst the FBI used Warren Grace to build their case, Jonathan Luna was busy prosecuting other cases. In September 2002, he prosecuted notorious bank robber Nicole Brown. Nicole Brown was being defended by Kenneth Ravenel, who would also later represent Dion Smith. On the 16th of September 2002, $63,123 was wheeled into the courtroom, sealed into 3 separate bags. The money was seized from the safe of Brown's accomplice. It was wheeled into the court, shown to the jury and judge, and entered into evidence. At the conclusion of the court day, the money had to be taken to the evidence vault in the courthouse. Jonathan Luna and the FBI agent in charge of the case were responsible for escorting the money to the vault. On the 26th of September, 10 days later, once the trial was concluded, the judge ruled all the evidence could be returned. And it was here that it was discovered that a bag of the money was missing. The bag missing contained $38,100. And what was significant about that bag was that it contained all of the money that the FBI couldn't identify or couldn't trace back to a bank that it was stolen from. Agents in charge of the case from the FBI Baltimore field office were officially the ones responsible for the money and to ensure its safekeeping. So who do you think was handed the investigation to find out what happened to the missing money? The Baltimore FBI field office, of course. It's not known if the money ever made it into the vault. If it didn't, that would indicate that Jonathan Luna played a part in its disappearance. But it's more than possible the money was stolen from the vault at a later time. 10 days had passed before anyone had noticed it missing. That's a lot of time for somebody to arrange to take it, and many people came and went from the vault. The story was leaked to the media soon after. The media reported that more than $36,000 was missing. They didn't have the exact figure, so from that point on it was reported and became public belief that $36,000 was stolen. The case came to be known in the papers as the missing $36,000. The FBI conducted their investigation, they interviewed everyone involved. Everyone from the judge down was interviewed. The FBI was eager to dodge any blame for the missing money. They had to try and lay the blame somewhere else. This created tension between the Baltimore FBI field office and the Baltimore US Attorney's Office. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation into Deon Smith and Walter Poindexter continued. It didn't come to an end until May 13, 2003, when they raided Deon Smith's stash house records and arrested both Deon and Walter. Both were charged with trafficking heroin. Walter was also charged with murdering Alvin Jones. Although the murder trial would be conducted separately, Deon and Walter were to be tried together on the trafficking charges, and if the murder of Alvin Jones was brought up, that would be unfair to Deon, as he had nothing to do with it, and it would more than likely result in a mistrial. So the prosecution had to be careful not to mention the murder in the drug trafficking trial. Jonathan Luna still had to file paperwork to the court about the murder, and he made sure to include just how much information they had to prove the murder was drug-related. He threatened Walter with the death penalty. They had taped conversations detailing the murder, they had Warren's testimony, and they also had other witnesses. This was important because with a drug-related murder, no plea deal could be negotiated. Jonathan Luna was required under federal law to prosecute it. The joint trial for Deon and Walter's trafficking charges began on the 1st of December 2003. Jonathan Luna failed to mention that Warren Grace had repeatedly violated the terms of his plea agreement. They also failed to disclose he was a paid informant. This information should have been provided in discovery, but it wasn't, and it would have serious consequences. Warren Grace was called to the stand to testify the first day of trial, and he failed in the witness box, mumbling his answers and being unclear with things. He was a bad witness. In fact, it was so bad the judge called an early end to the day to allow Luna to work with him overnight. It was hoped that maybe he would be a little more useful in the witness box the following day. Despite Luna not disclosing any of the information about Warren to the defence, somebody had tipped them off. And before the day ended, the defence team raised the issue with the judge that they had information suggesting Warren Grace had repeatedly violated the terms of his plea agreement by dealing drugs and engaging in violent behaviour, and that Agent Skinner had effectively turned a blind eye. It was an even more hot topic than usual because at this very moment a congressional investigation was being conducted into the FBI's criminal mishandling of informants. Imagine how nervous the FBI agents involved in this case, Agent Skinner being the main one, and Jonathan Luna himself were feeling when the defence team raised this. It was career-ending stuff, especially when the judge asked to see a copy of the violations report. That was a big problem, because there wasn't one. Day 1 was a shocking start for Luna, and it didn't get much better on day 2. At the start of the day, Warren Grace got back into the witness box and detailed the heroin operation of Deon Smith and Walter Poindexter. But again, Warren struggled. He couldn't quite seem to lay the groundwork that Poindexter and Smith were involved in a conspiracy together to traffic heroin. Luna goes on to pull a very surprising move. He gets Warren to testify the violations that he committed against his plea deal. Obviously, sweeping the violations under the rug hadn't worked, so Luna decided to come out swinging. He decided he wanted to show the jury he was not trying to hide anything. Luna was described as a sharp attorney, experienced in criminal trials. But in this case, he seemed anything but. He was scolded by the judge on more than one occasion for things like inappropriately trying to get evidence in and for forgetting to bring evidence to the court, forgetting other files. It seemed like he was lost. It was a very un-Luna-like performance. With Warren's plea violations now on record, it created the opportunity for the defence. They filed a motion to have all charges dismissed. But the judge refused. Warren's credibility was shot, and Luna and the FBI were in trouble for trying to keep it quiet, but there was still the issue of the hours of tapes detailing Dion and Walter's drug trafficking activities. The judge wasn't ready to dismiss just yet. But the defence kept arguing the issue, and Luna ended up lying. He said he did in fact hand the documents over detailing the violations, and he can't explain why the defence is saying they didn't get them. But the defence weren't having any of it. They kept hammering the point of misbehaviour and a cover-up by Luna and Agent Skinner. The defence then tried their luck for a mistrial, and the judge said he would consider it overnight. A mistrial wasn't as good as a dismissal because with a mistrial, a new trial could start over again at a later date, and Walter and Dion would have to stay in prison until that new trial started. Later that night, once day 2 of the trial had concluded, the defence were tipped off with further information. And the next day, December 3rd, 2003, day 3 of the trial, they withdrew their application for a mistrial and argued for a full-blown dismissal. They now had information Luna and the FBI had conspired with the judge to block him issuing a warrant for Warren Grace over his plea deal violations. Despite these allegations, the judge refused to dismiss the charges. There were still the tapes, after all. The trial continued and Warren Grace got back into the witness box, and they now go through the tape recordings. When he finished his testimony, the defence elected to delay their cross-examination of him. The judge ordered Warren not to talk about his testimony or his violations or any other issues in the case with either Luna or the FBI until he had been questioned by the defence. Agent Skinner then took the stand, and another cat is let out of the bag. Skinner admitted in the box that Warren was a paid informant. The defence still weren't aware of that. And they couldn't believe what they were hearing. They made another objection, yet more information that wasn't disclosed to them that should have been. But the judge overruled and just wanted to keep the trial moving forward. Skinner then went on to detail the violations committed by Warren, trying to avoid any blame or any knowledge, before getting into the actual evidence against Dion and Walter. At the conclusion of Skinner's testimony, the defence successfully argued for a federal court inquiry into the mishandling and cover-ups involving Warren Grace. The judge orders the FBI, Luna and the US Attorney's Office be investigated. Anxious for that not to happen, Luna came up with a plea deal. He discussed the deal with the defence attorneys in the lunch break. The lawyer for Poindexter demanded the murder charge be dropped as part of the deal. So the deal offered was about 10 years in prison for Smith, who was facing 30, and 15 years in prison for Poindexter, who was facing the possibility of the death penalty, or at least life without. Although the defence had exposed some serious issues with the handling of the case, they knew it was a great deal for their clients, as there was still the issue of their clients being recorded on tape with the drug trafficking. It was hard to make those recordings go away, and the judge had already denied a dismissal twice because of those tapes. When the deal was taken to Smith and Poindexter, they couldn't say yes quick enough. They knew how lenient the deal was. Luna agreed to the request to drop the murder charge, but the problem was he couldn't. It was against the law. The murder charge was drug-related, and no plea deal could be negotiated. Federal rules. Luna must prosecute a drug-related murder. But Luna's neck depended on the plea agreement going ahead. So did the necks of a few of his work colleagues in the US Attorney's Office, and a few necks at the FBI Baltimore field office as well. And the neck of one judge. But Luna had already placed too much in the court file detailing just how related to drugs the murder of Alvin Jones was. It was too late to make that disappear. But Luna agreed to the deal anyhow. When court resumed after lunch, Luna informed the judge that they had come to an agreement. They approached the bench, and the judge said that he wanted it signed in writing before he sent the jury home. It's here that Poindexter's lawyer questions if Luna could even make the deal happen, given the issue of the murder charge. But Luna says to the judge that he will be able to take care of it. Until it was in writing though, the judge wanted to move forward with the trial. At the conclusion of the third day's evidence, the judge instructed Luna to either have the plea agreement signed off in writing or to come to court the next morning with his next witness ready to go. After court concluded, Luna got to work on the deal, trying to work out how to make the murder of Alvin Jones go away so it could cover up the scandal and impending investigation in a federal court. Luna couldn't approve the deal himself either. It had to be signed off by his superiors. So how did Luna make the evidence that it was a drug-related murder disappear? Well, he couldn't. It was too late. There was no way Luna could make this plea agreement lawfully, unless he lied and said there was no evidence it was a drug-related murder. Luna would be badly exposed if he went down that path though. It wouldn't take much digging to show that it was a lie. And if he was caught lying on an official court document, that would mean his career would be over. He would never practice law again. Luna obviously struggled back and forth with this throughout the afternoon and into the night. He stayed in his office working on the deal for hours. He sought the help of his work colleague, Assistant US Attorney James Warwick. He then made a quick trip home for dinner before returning to his office to keep working on the deal. He worked all the way up to just before midnight. He completed the deal for Dion Smith easily enough, but he couldn't complete the deal for Walter Poindexter. Shortly before midnight, Luna left his office, with Walter Poindexter's deal still unfinished, only half completed on his computer. Luna left his seeing glasses and his mobile phone on his desk. It is unknown if Luna was alone or if there was somebody else with him. Despite being a federal building, security wasn't that high. Actually, it was described as being virtually non-existent at the time. There were no security cameras inside to show what happened. But we do know that at 11:38 p.m, Luna's car is recorded leaving the building. We don't know if he was alone in the car or not, but interestingly, Luna needed his glasses to drive, and they were up on his desk in his office. Luna's car started to head out of town. In fact, it actually headed out of the state. This was the beginning of an extremely strange journey that would go through 4 states before the night was out. He headed out of state and drove into Delaware. At 12:57 a.m, Luna or somebody using his card withdrew $200 from an ATM at the rest stop in Delaware. As luck would have it, the security cameras weren't working at the time this withdrawal was made. This Delaware stop was about halfway to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia prison is where Warren Grace was being held. That may have something to do with why I was headed in that direction. Luna's trip to Delaware was recorded on his electronic toll tag, but after his withdrawal of the $200, the remaining tolls of Luna's journey were paid with cash. At 2:37 a.m, Luna's car entered the New Jersey Turnpike. This is 1 hour and 40 minutes since the ATM withdrawal, but this journey would only take about 45 minutes, so there is close to an hour missing. Shortly after heading into New Jersey, the car headed west towards Pennsylvania. Luna's car enters the Pennsylvania Turnpike at about 2:47 a.m. A turnpike is a toll road for those who might be unaware. At 3:20 a.m, Luna's debit card is used again, this time to buy petrol at a rest stop on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And wouldn't you know it, the security cameras failed to capture anything yet again. At 4:04 a.m, Luna's car left the Pennsylvania Turnpike at exit 286. The toll booth ticket was later found to have a small spot of Luna's blood on it. This journey was bizarre and made no sense at all. Was somebody deliberately trying to make it confusing, to throw investigators off? About 2 miles from the turnpike, Luna's car was found abandoned in an isolated area off a dirt road near a warehouse used by a drilling company. The drilling company was still in operation, but it wasn't open at night time, so it was a quiet area. Nobody was around. Tyre tracks show Luna's car was first behind the warehouse, and this is where it was thought that Luna was left for dead. He had been stabbed 36 times. Stab wounds all over his body, including his back, and extensive defensive wounds on his hands. There was a large pool of blood on the floor in the back seat of the car, but there was also blood on the driver's side door. So this is where it was thought Luna may have been left for dead in the back seat, but he managed to get into the driver's seat to try and get away. The car drove from the warehouse a short distance over to a nearby creek, and that's where it's thought Jonathan may have got out of the car to try to run. His body was found face down in the creek, right next to his car. Despite his extensive wounds, the actual cause of death was drowning. Jonathan Luna was still wearing his courtroom business suit, shirt and tie, overcoat, and his court shoes. His courthouse ID badge was still hanging around his neck. The car was still running, and there was about $30 scattered throughout. Luna was found about 5:30am that morning, the 4th of December, when employees from the drilling company started to arrive to work. That morning was also day 4 of Poindexter's and Smith's trial. Court started at 9:30am. It still wasn't known by those involved in the case that Luna had been killed. Assistant US Attorney James Warwick, who Luna had spoken to the night before about the deal, appeared in court on his behalf. He apologised to the judge for Luna's absence and said they didn't know where he was. The office was still trying to track him down. However, he had some knowledge of the case and was prepared to act on Luna's behalf. Warwick rushed ahead with the plea agreement, despite Luna's absence. Warwick ran up to Luna's office to try and find the plea deals. He found Smith's completed, but Poindexter's was still unfinished on the computer. So Warwick took it upon himself to finish it and returned to the court with the 2 completed, signed-off plea deals. What Luna couldn't or wouldn't do the night before, James Warwick had done in about an hour or so. Nobody seemed too concerned Luna was missing at this point. It's amazing all this was allowed to go ahead and was rushed through the way it was. The defence signed the deal and it was done. Poindexter was not prosecuted for the murder of Alvin Jones. The murder was essentially swept under the rug. It wasn't long after this that news of Luna's death broke. The coroner immediately ruled Luna was the victim of a vicious homicide. The coroner was quoted as saying, "You would think they were perhaps after information from the guy when you see something like this." He said this because some of the wounds were only very shallow and it looked as though the knife was maybe just being held to his body. What you would do trying to get information out of somebody or threatening them. Given there was a spot of blood on Luna's toll ticket when the car left the Pennsylvania Turnpike and a large pool of blood found in the back seat, it's quite possible he was being tortured during this bizarre journey the car took. Only days later, stories were leaked to the media from unnamed federal law sources reminding everybody about the missing $36,000. Then there was information leaked suggesting Luna was involved in affairs and posting on internet dating sites. There were stories of him having a large amount of debt that his wife didn't know about and that he was having problems in the workplace. So it seems as though a public smear campaign was well underway. Quite obviously, they were trying to make it clear there were plenty of motives for his murder, none of which were to do with his work. And the FBI quickly told the media they believed Luna's death was not related to his work and it was more than likely the result of a personal relationship turning bad. About 6 weeks later, in January 2004, a penknife was found in the creek right next to the spot that Luna's body was found. This was interesting, as it was found in a spot that had already been extensively searched. How was it that it wasn't found prior to this? The next month, in February, more unnamed law sources leaked to the media that they were strongly considering the possibility that Luna committed suicide. They also leaked he was due to face a polygraph test over the missing $36,000 just prior to his death. That, combined with his debt and the other alleged problems leaked to the media in Luna's life, were the reasons given for suicide. A pretty amazing theory when you consider the blood on the toll ticket, the pool of blood in the back seat, the defensive wounds to his hands, and the wounds on his back. Also, there was genital mutilation involved. So Jonathan Luna drove himself through 4 states, stabbed himself 36 times, which would have had to have started while he was driving because there was blood on the toll ticket, then jumped into the back seat to stab himself some more, then ran into the creek to drown himself. The FBI tried to get the coroner to rule Luna's death was a suicide. The coroner who originally ruled Luna's death a homicide had moved on. The new coroner refused the FBI's request, confirming the original ruling that Luna's death was a homicide. And years later, a third coroner would also confirm Luna's death was a homicide. To this day, the investigation is still ongoing. There is a $100,000 reward for any information leading to the case being solved. There are no known suspects and no known motive. At least none that are being made public anyway. Walter Poindexter was later sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was never prosecuted for the murder of Alvin Jones. Dion Smith got just over 9 years in prison. And Warren Grace was sentenced to 7 years in prison with credit for time already served. And there's an interesting side note to all of this. It doesn't have anything to do with Jonathan Luna's death, but it just goes to show what sort of a city he was working in at the time. Just prior to his death, others in his office were close to handing down an indictment against former Baltimore Police Commissioner and now the Maryland State Police Superintendent, Edward Norris, along with his former Chief of Staff and others, for corruption and fraud in their handling of police accounts. They were caught using police funds to pay for sexual favours, escorts, to finance luxury hotel suites, to buy girls' lingerie, pay for expensive dinners, and so on. This was all going down at the time of Luna's death. In fact, the charges were filed within a week after his death. So that's what the people in charge of the police were up to. A similar scandal was uncovered around the same time involving police and other officials in Pennsylvania. As I said, it's not suggested this is in any way related to Luna's death. It just provides a nice snapshot of what was going on in Baltimore at the time. One of Luna's closest friends has a theory why the experienced, usually well-prepared, intelligent prosecutor appeared to bumble and fumble his way through the trial of Poindexter and Smith, making it look as though he had no idea at times. Ultimately, his actions would lead to the judge ordering a federal investigation. And Luna's friend's theory was that Luna knew exactly what he was doing and what his actions would lead to, and it's exactly what he wanted to happen. This is what his close friend Danny Rivera had to say. You have to understand Joey. He was sly and extremely smart. He didn't always do things straight on. He was smart enough to sometimes work below the surface. Joey couldn't have liked that stuff Skinner and the others were pulling. I know Joey. But what was he going to do about it? That stuff about leaving things back on his desk and not knowing how to introduce evidence, come on. I've been with Joey in court. He was sharp. That's not Joey. Don't you see? He was trying to expose them. On the 4th of March 2008, Julian Buchwald took his girlfriend Carolyn Watson for a picnic lunch to a waterfall located on a remote property in Budgeree, country Victoria. The day soon turned into a nightmare when Julian and Carolyn were abducted by a masked attacker. It wasn't long before Julian's mother located a frightening note from a satanic cult claiming responsibility for the abduction and threatening to kill both Julian and Carolyn, both of whom were devout Christians. This sparked a frantic, widespread search. Would Julian and Carolyn be found alive? Was this really the work of a satanic cult? Or was there something even more sinister going on? Julian Buchwald was 22 years old. He was from Budgeree, a small country town in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, about 160 kilometres, which is about 100 miles southeast of Melbourne. Carolyn Watson was 17 years old. She lived nearby to Julian in the town of Churchill, also in the Latrobe Valley of Victoria. They were both small country towns, and both Julian and Carolyn still live with their parents. On the 4th of March 2008, Julian and Carolyn had organised to go on a picnic at Julian's parents' property in Budgeree. The property was a rural, remote area, mostly bushland. It covered an area of about 500 hectares, which is about 5 kilometres squared or around 2 miles squared, so it's a pretty large area. Julian and Carolyn planned to visit a waterfall that was on the property to have their lunch together. Julian picked Carolyn up in the morning in his 99 gold-coloured four-wheel drive Nissan Patrol, and they left for the waterfall. They planned to be back around 3 p.m. that afternoon. They took only basic clothing and only the food and drink they needed for lunch. Before they arrived at the waterfall, Julian stopped the car to check out the carcass of a dead animal he had seen. So he stops the car and tells Carolyn he will be back in a few minutes. He'd stopped the car a little up the road from the carcass, so he had to walk back a short distance and he was out of sight from Carolyn. As he kneels down to check out the carcass, the nightmare begins. He hears footsteps running up behind him and he feels a hard blow to the back of his head, and he goes out cold, knocked unconscious. While this is happening, Carolyn remains waiting in the car. After about 5 to 10 minutes, she starts getting a little concerned. It wasn't unusual for Julian to stop the car and get out to look at various things, dead animals included, but he usually was pretty quick about it. He didn't usually take this long. Carolyn starts to think about getting out of the car to go and look for Julian when a person catches her eye in the side mirror. A person dressed in black, wearing gloves and a balaclava is charging towards the car. Carolyn screams, but before she can think about locking herself in the car, the attacker has the door open and drags her out. Carolyn gets thrown to the ground hard. The attacker doesn't waste any time. He immediately hog-ties her and covers her mouth with duct tape. He then picks her up and throws her into the back seat of the car. A little while later, the attacker gets into the driver's seat and starts driving away. Carolyn was beyond terrified. She assumes the worst, thinking she's about to be raped and murdered. After several hours of driving, the attacker eventually stops. Carolyn was dragged out of the car and thrown to the ground. Her mouth was still duct taped shut, so she couldn't scream. She was still hog-tied, so she couldn't move. And then she heard the sound that made her certain her life was about to end. Julian and Carolyn obviously didn't arrive home at 3 p.m. It was out of character for them to be late. Julian's mother starts to worry and starts pacing around, walking up the driveway to see if there's any sign of them coming up the road. And that's when she sees it. A bottle stuck through their wire fence, with a piece of paper hanging out. Julian's mother quickly opened up the piece of paper, and she nearly fainted. The piece of paper read, and there's a language warning here. You bloody couldn't leave us alone, so your son and girl went walkabout. You get Carolyn and Julian back when we finish our business in the area, but only if you behave yourself and don't shit us around again. Tell everyone they are on holiday. Don't you dare talk to the cops again, and you'll get your kids back. Shit us again, and you never see them again, because we'll fuck the girl to death and burn her alive, and the bloody boy will really enjoy the torture and sacrifice to our God to pay back 180 times the hurts he did to us when we picked him up. This is your last warning. Do what we say, and the kids come back in a live condition. Julian's mother is obviously terrified and distraught. She immediately calls the police. Threats don't get too more serious than this. The police were on high alert straight away. They organised a large search operation by both land and by air. It wasn't an easy search. Not only was there a large area they had to cover, it was also very tricky terrain. It's remote bushland with a huge amount of dirt roads, hidden roads, side roads, and extensive off-road, thick bush area. It was a hard search made harder by the fact the pressure was on. It sounded like Carolyn and Julian were in the hands of complete psychopaths. While the search was being conducted, detectives got to work trying to find out who was responsible and what their motive was. The note indicates there was some kind of prior history between the kidnappers and the Buchwald family. But not to the Buchwald's knowledge. They couldn't make any sense of the letter or the threats. They hadn't had trouble with anyone. But when interviewing Carolyn's parents, they were shocked to find out they had gotten a threatening letter from the same person about 10 days earlier. The letter said words to the effect of, "Mind your own business and stay away, or I will make your life a bloody misery and destroy you and your family." It also says Christians are their enemies. Carolyn's father found it left on their front porch one morning and reported it to local police. However, nothing was done. It was chalked up to be a sick prank at the time. Carolyn's father immediately recognised it was from the same person, as it had the same writing and also the same symbol that was on the letter found at the Buchwalds. The symbol on both letters gave them a hint as to why Christians were their enemies. It was a satanic symbol. It was the symbol of the ONA, the Order of Nine Angles, a satanic cult known to preach human sacrifice. The letters were very concerning for police and gave them grave fears for Carolyn and Julian's safety. They were both devout Christians, which is why they felt they were targeted by a satanic cult. Police feared they would make good on their threats and conduct a human sacrifice on them. After 48 hours of extensive searching, there was still no trace of Julian or Carolyn. News quickly spread of their disappearance through the local community, and their church pastor held constant prayer vigils for their safe return. Police interviewed the pastor to get his take on the satanic cult angle. They felt he might be able to provide some valuable information. What he had to say surprised police. They thought he would be the first to believe in a satanic cult being responsible, but he wasn't. He didn't even believe they were kidnapped. He believed they had just run away together. Through their questioning of the pastor, they learnt that Julian and Carolyn were strict believers in their faith, and for that reason, the physical side of their relationship had not gotten past holding hands. He had recently had a meeting with the couple and learnt that they had planned to get married, but couldn't just yet because of Carolyn's age. The pastor believed that's what they had done, run away together to get married. Although he couldn't explain the two notes that were found, the language and vile nature of the notes was far removed from anything Julian and Carolyn would do. Police started to investigate the possibility that Julian and Carolyn had run away together, but they didn't get very far with it. Remember, Julian and Carolyn didn't take any clothes or supplies with them, and they only had the food they had packed for their lunch. Also, their bank accounts hadn't been touched. The running away together theory didn't really hold water, especially when you add in the threatening letters that had been received. Police were of the firm belief that Julian and Carolyn had been the victims of foul play. They focused their investigation into the Order of Nine Angles cult. They found the satanic cult was started in England in the 1960s. They had affiliates around the world. The cult advocated a spiritual path in which practitioners were required to isolate themselves from society, commit crimes, embrace political extremism and violence, and carry out a human sacrifice. The problem the police ran into was that they couldn't find any evidence of the cult existing in Australia. They had no reports of anyone being a member of the cult. There were no previous cases on record involving the cult. There weren't even any rumours or speculation of the cult existing anywhere in the country. This was baffling, and there were fears that an Australian chapter had just formed, and they wanted to start off with a bang by conducting a human sacrifice. Almost a week went by, and there was still no trace of Julian or Carolyn. The searches had come up empty. There was no sign of them anywhere. The feeling was that the chances of finding them alive were now slim to none. Police switched the focus of the search to finding remains, rather than finding them alive. The rugged bushland had extremely hot temperatures in the day, but became freezing cold at night. There were snakes and spiders everywhere. Not easy conditions at the best of times, but when you consider Julian and Carolyn had no food or supplies and minimal clothing, the conditions became that much worse. The remote area meant there were no witnesses, so there was no information coming in from the public at all to help the investigation. The only motive police could establish at this stage was the Order of Nine Angles cult wanting to commit a human sacrifice. But given there was no information to suggest the cult even existed in Australia, police started to explore the possibility that the notes were left as a diversion to throw them off the trail of the real abductors. But 7 days after their disappearance, when all hope seemed lost and police thought they were looking for bodies, the miracle happened. Julian and Carolyn were found alive. They stumbled out onto the road near the Alpine National Park, hundreds of kilometres away from their picnic destination. They were picked up by a farmer who was driving along the road. They would have stood out. Both were in pretty bad shape. They had cuts and bruises and both suffered from bad sunburn. Their bodies were covered in blisters. Detectives wasted no time. They interviewed them straight away. They needed as much information as possible. The attackers were still out there. They thought it very possible other family members of Carolyn or Julian could be at risk. Carolyn is interviewed and details her attack to police. The attacker dug the hole only a few metres away from her. The attacker then made his way towards Carolyn. He cut her clothing off with a knife, leaving her completely naked and still tied up. She was convinced she was about to be raped, murdered, and then buried in the hole. Carolyn does about the only thing she can do. She starts to pray. She prays and prays and prays. And almost as if God himself had shown up to save her, the attacker disappears. She has no idea where he went or what he was doing, but she seemed to be spared for the time being. But she was still tied up and couldn't move. Sometime later, she hears a familiar voice, Julian's voice. She cries out, "Julian, is that you?" He screams back, "Yes." Julian is also tied up and naked, and had just woken up after being knocked out. He wiggles his way through the scrub over to Carolyn. He sees a knife laying on the ground next to her, obviously left there by the attacker. He grabs the knife, and with Carolyn's help, they are able to cut the rope. They stand up and see the attacker had left behind a sleeping bag and a few items of food. They were both terrified. They had no idea where he was, but they could only assume he was coming back at some stage. So they grabbed the sleeping bag and the bits of food and ran off. They were barefoot, naked, battling the extreme heat during the day and the freezing cold at night. They both had cut feet and cuts on their body from the bush. They were both badly sunburnt. And they both wondered if their lives were about to end, if the attacker tracked them down. It was a horrific experience. During their ordeal, they got a bit disorientated and ended up back near the site that they had escaped from. This was bad, as it meant the attacker was probably nearby, but they got lucky. While they were checking out the site, Julian spots the backpack that they had taken with them the day of the picnic. He runs over and gets it, and they are in luck. Their clothing is inside. Julian runs back to Carolyn with the backpack, and they are able to clothe themselves. They stumble around the bush for another few days before lucking out and finding the road where they were picked up by the farmer. Luckily, the attacker never caught up with them again. It was important that police identify the site where they escaped from. There would be a lot of evidence there, which could help them track down whoever was responsible. Police conducted an extensive search of the bush area around where Carolyn and Julian were found, and they got lucky. They found the site. They found bits of rope and items of clothing. They also found the knife, the shovel, and the duct tape. They had a lot of evidence. Not only that, they were able to identify the person that owned all of those items. It was great news, albeit somewhat confusing news, and it posed a lot more questions than answers, because the owner of those items was Julian. Something didn't add up. As far as police could tell, the attacker didn't bring any of his own equipment to use. He used all of Julian's stuff. But how did he get it? There was another problem. Julian had described to police how he was whacked over the head by the attacker, knocking him unconscious. Then he doesn't remember anything till he woke up, naked, tied up in the bush. But the mark on Julian's head from where he had been struck was hardly visible. It didn't really match up with his story of being hit hard and knocked out. Police start to wonder if Julian was somehow involved in his own kidnapping. Detectives let Julian know his story wasn't adding up. They were upfront with him. They basically told him his story was full of shit. They told him to tell them the truth. And he eventually cracked. The evidence exposed his lies. He knew it was all over. He made full admissions to police that he orchestrated the whole attack. He was the sole person responsible for Carolyn's kidnapping, faking his own kidnapping in the process. Julian tells detectives everything. He points out the spot where he stashed all of his supplies. He had pre-planned the attack, he had buried a map and the other supplies that he needed, such as the shovel, knife, rope and duct tape. He lied about seeing the dead animal carcass. He used that time to change and disguise himself as the kidnapper. He tied Carolyn up and then drove 6 hours north to the remote Alpine National Park area. So no wonder the police search failed. They had no hope of finding them. They weren't searching anywhere near there. Julian chillingly recounts how Carolyn was begging him to stop, saying please don't do this, pleading for her life. He describes how he cut off her clothes and dug the hole. He then details how he took his own clothes off and tied himself up, and how he started calling out to Carolyn a while later, to make it look like he had been attacked as well. So police had their man. But why the hell would anybody want to kidnap their girlfriend and stage their own kidnapping? What reason could possibly exist for Julian to do that? The reason is, Julian staged the whole thing to try and have sex with Carolyn and to get her to marry him. Throughout the entire ordeal, Julian was in Carolyn's ear saying that they had to have sex to keep warm at night, and for that reason, it wouldn't be wrong in the eyes of God. But Carolyn stuck strong to her faith and refused Julian's advances for sex and refused his marriage proposals. They had planned to get married one day, but there was tension between them about the timing. Julian wanted to get married now, whereas Carolyn wanted to wait until she finished her studies. Plus, she wasn't old enough. At no stage was Julian ever lost. He knew exactly where they were the entire time. He just pretended to be lost as an excuse to spend more time with Carolyn to try and get her to crack and have sex with him. Julian thought he would only need a couple of days. He'd get Carolyn to either have sex with him or agree to get married, or both. And then they would leave the area. But after a week, it became apparent Carolyn was having none of it. So he made his way out towards the road to be rescued. Julian was charged with unlawfully carrying away against one's will, abduction with intent to marry, abduction for sexual penetration, and theft. The court heard that as a result of being hogtied and left in the back of the vehicle for 6 hours, Carolyn had severe damage to her neck, back and hands. Julian was found guilty at court in 2009, but he wasn't remanded into custody straight away. He was allowed to stay out on bail while awaiting the sentencing hearing. But Julian didn't want to hang around for his sentencing date. He would have known he was going to get jail time for what he did. So he tried to pull off an escape. He got hold of a fake Indian passport, he dyed his hair and darkened his skin in an attempt to look Indian. It was a ridiculous disguise. But he somehow managed to fool Australian customs because he got out of the country. Thankfully, he didn't get very far. He was detained when he landed, his real identity was discovered, and he was extradited back to Australia. His plan was to eventually make his way to Germany, where he had relatives. He was later sentenced to 7 years and 3 months for kidnapping Carolyn, and he was sentenced to a further 6 months for skipping bail and leaving the country. He had a non-parole period of 5 years and 3 months, meaning he is eligible for release now. And if he isn't out already, it won't be long until he is. On the 4th of August 2002, best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman disappeared from the small town of Soham in England. One of England's biggest ever manhunts followed. After 2 weeks, the media was critical of police and their perceived lack of progress on the case. But the police did have a suspect. Best friends Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells both grew up in the small town of Soham in the county of Cambridgeshire, England. The population of Salem was around 8,500 people. It is a small, charming, beautiful town. Jessica and Holly met when they were just 4 years old. They struck up an instant bond. They were always playing together and were described as being more like sisters. Jessica was the youngest of 3 girls. She was well behaved and a lively child, a healthy outdoors type, a bit of a tomboy. She liked to play sports. She had a bubbly personality and was very friendly and chatty. Holly was more of a feminine type. She enjoyed dressing up, dancing and playing with makeup. Although she did like sport as well, she wasn't as into it as Jessica. She was also bright, bubbly and very intelligent, always smiling and happy. Both girls were 10 years old and were considered sensible and mature for their age. Both were only allowed to visit homes of friends who their parents knew. Jessica had a mobile phone and would keep in regular contact with her mother whenever she was away from the house. On Sunday the 4th of August 2002, Jessica was at Holly's house, where Holly's parents were hosting a barbecue for some close friends. About 5 p.m, the girls decided to dress up in identical clothing. So they both put on red Manchester United jerseys and matching black shorts. Holly's mother Nicola saw them dressed up the same and took a photo of them in their matching outfit. Both girls were committed Manchester United fans, mainly due to the fact their favourite player David Beckham was in the side. About 5:30 p.m, the girls decided they were bored of the barbecue and went for a walk. They left Holly's house and walked towards the centre of town. They stopped in at a shop to buy some lollies, then walked down towards the vacant Salem Village College, which is a high school, kids aged 12 and up. Police were able to reconstruct this particular part of the girls' walk from CCTV cameras and witnesses. They were both still dressed in their identical Manchester United outfits, so people remembered seeing them. When they got to Salem Village College, they made their way to the caretaker's house, where their favourite teacher, Maxine Carr, lived, with her fiancé, Ian Huntley. The girls weren't students at the college, they were still in primary school at St Andrews, which was next to the college. And St Andrews is where Maxine Carr, aged 25, worked. She was a teacher's assistant, not an actual teacher, but the girls loved her. She was popular with all the students. Maxine's fiancé, Ian Huntley, aged 28, was the caretaker at Salem College, so that's why they lived together in the caretaker's house. The girls got there around 6:30 p.m. Ian Huntley was out the front washing his dog. The girls chatted to Ian and he says that they asked if Maxine, or Miss Carr as they referred to her, was around. Ian told them she was up taking a bath as she wasn't feeling well. The girls asked him if Maxine got the permanent teaching position at St Andrews that she had applied for, and they were disappointed to learn that she hadn't, and she wouldn't be returning to St Andrews after the summer break. The girls told Ian to say hello to Miss Carr for them, and then he says he saw them skip off happily down the road. At 8 p.m, the girls still hadn't arrived home. Nicola tried to call them so they could come home and say goodbye to the guests of the barbecue as it was finishing up, but she didn't get an answer. Nicola started to become concerned. She searched every room of the house, then ran outside and looked up and down the street, then ran back inside and searched every room of the house again. There was no sign of them. By 8:45 p.m, Nicola and Holly's father, Kevin, thought something was seriously wrong. Holly and Jessica knew they had to be home by 8:30, no matter what. Nicola called Jessica's mother, Sharon, and got the bad news. The girls weren't there either. Sharon became immediately alarmed. She called Jessica's phone, but the phone was switched off. She tried again and again, many more times, but the phone remained off. Sharon became panicked. She frantically started to call friends and family members, but no one had seen the girls. Both her and Jessica's father, Leslie, immediately went out searching for them. They checked everywhere they could think of in town, but there was no sign of them anywhere. After about an hour, they made their way to the Wells' house to see if the girls gave any possible clues as to where they were going, but they gave none. The disappearance was completely out of character for the two well-behaved girls. They'd never done anything like this before. At 10 p.m, the police were called. They got there pretty quickly and started to arrange search teams to try and find the girls. Police checked in with all their other friends, not only to see if they were there, but also to see if their friends could think of somewhere they would go that their parents wouldn't be aware of. But they got no information to help. News quickly spread around the small town, and a lot of the other town members came out to help in the search. They made their way to the grounds of the Soham Village College to see if they were maybe hiding in the school grounds there somewhere. The caretaker, Ian Huntley, immediately offered his help to assist with the search and unlock the college. When he learnt what was going on, he realised the missing girls were Holly and Jessica, who he had spoken to only hours before. He immediately told the police they had walked by his house. At this point in time, he was the last known person to see the girls alive. The search went all throughout the night and went all over town, but there was no trace of Jessica or Holly. The next day, the 5th of August, the huge police operation started to get into full swing. It was called Operation Fincham, which is a random operation name generated by a computer. It has nothing to do with the actual case. There were grave fears for the girls, given it was completely out of their character to simply wander off. There weren't too many people around town who felt the girls had gone missing of their own volition. The area of Soham was relatively flat terrain. However, there were a lot of ditches, streams and rivers that had to be searched. Police divers were called in, but there was a lot of water to be covered, and underwater searching was slow work at the best of times. Soham also had extensive parkland areas, and given it was summer, a lot of the areas were overgrown and contained long grass, so the search wasn't straightforward. Over 500 townspeople volunteered to help search. They were tasked by police and used sticks to poke into the various ditches, hidey holes and long grassed areas to make sure they didn't miss anything. Some searched as long as 16 hours a day. Many held on to the firm belief that Jessica and Holly would be found alive. In the meantime, Soham became a ghost town. Parents were too frightened to allow their kids out of the house. Police hoped Jessica and Holly were just on an adventure gone wrong and they were okay, maybe too scared to come home. They even organised a message from the girls' hero David Beckham encouraging them to return home and that they weren't in any trouble, and appealing for anyone with information to come forward. By Wednesday, police had searched the entire area of Soham and the surrounding areas. They had received 2,500 phone calls, made 400 door-to-door interviews, and had stopped 700 cars in their effort to find the girls. Over 700 police officers were involved. The search included the use of a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment and the use of a plane from the nearby Air Force Base. But they had found nothing. 4 days into the search, police held a press conference and gave what little info they knew. It was here that they mentioned the girls were last seen by Soham College caretaker Ian Huntley, as the girls had walked past his house. Naturally, the media were pretty keen to hear what he had to say.
I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just said, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
By now, police and the media had based themselves in the grounds of Soham College and held daily meetings and press conferences there. Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr had both been a big help. As the caretaker of the college, Ian helped set up the chairs for press conferences and was on hand in case anything was needed. He also helped coordinate further searches throughout the school grounds. And once the media learnt the reason Jessica and Holly had gone by the college was to see Maxine Carr, they were eager to talk to her as well.
This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very, very upset because I didn't get my job, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
On Saturday the 10th of August, police organised a reconstruction of Holly and Jessica's final walk. 2 young actresses were dressed up in Manchester United jerseys and black shorts and retraced the girls' steps in the hopes it might spark something in somebody's memory. The next day, some sections of the media started to criticise the police and their lack of progress on the case, despite their mammoth effort. Unfortunately, as with a lot of cases of this magnitude, a lot of the calls received from the public were false leads and dead ends, including a lot of false sightings of the girls. This actually led the police making a public appeal for young children not to wear red Manchester United shirts in public, fearing it would create many more false sightings. A profile was made up of the abductor, but it was pretty broad. He was thought to be a local man, probably with previous sex offences, aged between 25 and 40. There were around 700 men with prior sex offences living within a reasonable distance of Soham. Both the police and Holly and Jessica's parents made direct appeals to the abductor through the media to return the girls home. This included an appeal by police urging the abductor to get in touch by midnight, and that instructions had been left on Jessica's phone via way of text message. This was an attempt to try and get the abductor to turn on Jessica's phone, which was still off, so they could get a signal on it and try and trace the location. But it didn't work. The phone remained off. Despite the perceived lack of progress from the eyes of the media, the police had a suspect, and they'd been working hard on him behind the scenes.
The police say that the answer is here in Soham. Do you agree with that line of inquiry, as they say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for two girls to go missing basically from our front doorstep, somebody would have seen or heard something if somebody had tried to get those girls into a car, if it had just been somebody passing through. It's very strange.
By now, Ian Huntley had been identified as a suspect, and police had pored over every word both he and Maxine Carr had uttered to the media, and there was a lot to pore through. Both were very willing to speak to the media throughout the investigation. The media regularly attended their house looking for interviews. Being the last person to see the girls and being the reason the girls were there was a big deal. The police turned up at their house regularly, presenting for what they made look like friendly chats, but each time they would go over his story again and again in the hope he would slip up. And it wasn't missed by anybody just how sparkling clean the inside of their house was. But all they had was suspicion. Neither had a criminal record, there was no physical evidence. As the days went on, analysts were able to narrow down to a much more precise location where Jessica's phone was switched off, and they were able to determine it was switched off somewhere very close to Ian and Maxine's residence. This led police to scrutinise them more closely, and they dug up that in 1998, only a few years prior, Ian had been charged with the rape of an 18-year-old girl, but the charge had later been dropped. That's why it wasn't showing up on a criminal record. Also, calls had started to come in. Maxine had given a version that she was home the night the girls disappeared, having a bath upstairs as she wasn't feeling well, so she didn't see them. But there were several witnesses from the Grimsby area that said otherwise. They contacted police to say Maxine was in Grimsby visiting her mother the night the girls disappeared. She was spotted by many people out on the town. She was drunk. There was no way she was having a bath at home when the girls came round to visit. On the 15th of August, police organised a town meeting designed to rattle Huntley. The meeting was held at the College Hall, so Huntley helped set it up. Police made it clear that the key to the case lay within the Soham community. They asked the question, was anyone doing anything differently? They encouraged people to look suspiciously at their neighbours and to ask themselves, how well did they really know certain people? The next day, the police made their move. They knocked on Huntley's door and asked both he and Maxine if they would like to go down to the station to answer some questions. They both went willingly, not under arrest at this stage. They were taken to two separate police stations to be interviewed, but no cracks emerged. They stuck solid to their stories. Police told Maxine they had witnesses placing her in Grimsby on the evening of the 4th, but she didn't crack. At 9:30pm, they were reunited in a nearby Holiday Inn room. Police arranged them to meet there. They still weren't under arrest. Police had bugged the room in the hopes they would slip up. In the meantime, other police searched Ian and Maxine's home. They also searched the college again and found a shed within the grounds that hadn't yet been searched, as Ian told police he didn't have a key for it. The shed contained the burnt clothing of Jessica and Holly. The clothing wasn't totally destroyed, so you could make out the Manchester United jerseys. Police found the key to the shed in Ian's house. He had lied about not having one. The clothes were found in a plastic bag. Ian's fingerprints were found on the bag. It was all but over. Both Maxine and Ian were arrested soon after, in the early hours of the 17th. Police were pretty certain Jessica and Holly were dead, and later that day their worst fears were confirmed when the girls' bodies were found in a ditch next to the Air Force Base at Lakenheath, about 17 miles away from Soham. The girls' bodies were disfigured, blackened and burnt. Maxine and Ian were subjected to extensive questioning, and police had to apply for warrants to hold them without charge. Although they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, they still wanted to crack their stories. They were eventually able to wear Maxine down a little and get her to admit she wasn't at home the night the girls disappeared and she was in Grimsby visiting her mother. This destroyed Ian's alibi. Carr says she lied to protect Ian when she found out he was the last known person to see the girls alive. She knew he would be a suspect, especially when police found out he had been charged with rape a few years earlier. She said she gave the alibi not because he was guilty, but to avoid him being suspected unfairly. As far as she was concerned, Ian was not responsible for the girls' deaths. But her actions suggested otherwise. If you remember back to that earlier media clip, she referred to the girls in the past tense, as she did in several other media interviews, when at that stage no one knew if the girls were still alive or not. She also helped Ian scrub the house clean, repeatedly, when she returned from Grimsby. So who were Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr? Ian was bullied at school, described as the class loner. He couldn't make friends and not even the teachers really liked him. He made one suicide attempt in high school. He left school at 16 and went from one low-paying job to another. He moved around a lot to different addresses, and whenever he arrived at a new address, he always lied and talked himself up. He was always making himself out to be better than he actually was. And once people started to catch on to his lies, he would move on to the next address. Ex-girlfriends reported that he was a control freak and liked to dominate and abuse them. After his arrest, many women came forward to detail their horrific experiences with him. There were several claims of rape, many claims of underage sex, and claims of sexual harassment. There were even claims that he kept girls locked in his flat when they refused to have sex with him. Many were too frightened to report him as he threatened them, but some did, and he was investigated for rape on 4 occasions and investigated for sleeping with underage girls on 3 occasions. None of the allegations stuck. There was never enough evidence to charge him, so he never got a criminal record out of it. But there was a clear pattern being established of a serial sex offender. The system failed by not catching on to it. Ian got married just before he turned 21 and subjected his first wife Claire to horrendous domestic abuse. He would erupt into fits of rages for no apparent reason and beat her up, leaving her battered and bruised. Claire didn't hang around and left a few weeks later, and she ended up marrying Ian's brother Wayne. Needless to say, Ian wasn't impressed. It actually caused him to have a breakdown and suffer depression. Claire said he wasn't upset about losing her, but he was upset about losing control of her. That's the type of person he was. Huntley soon went back to his old ways of seducing young schoolgirls. And he did eventually get charged with rape. He allegedly followed a drunk 18-year-old girl out of a nightclub one night after she had refused his advances. He raped her and he was arrested and charged a few days later. But after a week of being held in custody, police elected to drop the charges. They believed there was insufficient evidence, leaving the victim furious and leaving Ian still without a criminal record. There was a pattern here, horrible violence against women that he kept getting away with. No wonder his behaviour continued to escalate. Ian met Maxine Carr in a pub in 1998. Ian started chatting her up and there was an instant attraction. The relationship progressed quickly and they were soon living together. And it wasn't long before the mental and physical abuse started. But unlike previous partners, Maxine adored the ground Ian walked on and saw his violent, controlling behaviour as a sign of his affection and devotion towards her. In textbook domestic violence fashion, Ian would assault Maxine and then profess his love, say he was sorry and he would never do it again, only for the vicious cycle to start again. And it didn't take long before he started cheating on Maxine, with a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Maxine found out and attempted suicide. She didn't succeed, but Ian became more attracted to her, thinking she was willing to die for him. Little did he know Maxine was also cheating on him. They decided their relationship needed a fresh start. They got engaged and moved between several other towns before settling in Soham. Ian secured a job as the caretaker at the village college in September 2001. The school was home to around 1,300 students. Ian and Maxine moved into the caretaker's house. A police check was conducted, but as he had never been convicted of anything, no criminal history came up. In February 2002, Maxine landed a job as a teaching assistant at St Andrew's Primary School. She was an instant success with the kids. They loved her, but she didn't get on as well with the teachers. Despite his violent history, Ian fit in well with his new job. Other staff didn't have any doubts about his suitability at all. He developed a good relationship with many of the students, mainly the females. He tended to pick on the male students. All in all, Ian and Maxine settled into the town quite well. They didn't make any close friends, as they hadn't their whole lives, but they got on chatting terms with their neighbours, parents of children, and local shopkeepers. The attack on Jessica and Holly wasn't planned. Ian was a pedophile, and it's thought he couldn't resist the opportunity that presented itself when the girls turned up to his house. Maxine was away for the weekend in Grimsby, and he had just had a heated argument with her on the phone. He was worried she was cheating on him. And that's when Holly and Jessica showed up. The only person who will ever know the exact story is Ian, but it's thought that when he saw the girls he would have put on his charms and lured them inside on the pretense that Maxine was home and she would be happy to see them. It's thought they were killed soon after the door shut behind them. Although the crime wasn't planned, once Huntley realised the seriousness of what he had done, he became very well planned and organised. He wasn't sorry, but he was terrified of being caught. He thoroughly cleaned the house top to bottom, being sure to move out furniture so nothing was missed. When thinking of where to dispose of the bodies, he knew he couldn't put them anywhere in Soham. He also knew he couldn't travel any great distance. He knew about the airbase in Lakenheath, only 17 miles away, as he went plane spotting there, and that's where he decided would be a good spot. Plus his grandmother lived in that direction, so if he was spotted out that way, there was a reason for him to be there. He put the girls in his car and covered their bodies and made his way to Lakenheath. When he got there, he'd take plastic bags to his feet, careful not to leave footprints. He cut off their clothing, as he knew the clothing would be a means to easily identify the bodies, and he didn't want that to happen. He put the bodies in a ditch and then left with their clothing. When he arrived home, he put the clothes into a plastic bag and made his way to the shed on the college grounds. He put the clothes in a bin and then set them on fire. But the shed soon filled up with thick smoke, so he put it out. The clothes were burnt, but they were still largely intact. He didn't light them again, scared somebody would see the smoke. He locked the shed up, leaving the clothes inside, deciding to deal with them later. But he never got a chance, due to the constant heavy police presence on the college grounds. It became the makeshift base for the police and media. He threw out Jessica's mobile phone. It was never found. After scrubbing himself clean, he was able to make his way outside and pretend he had no idea what was going on, and he started to help with the search. He knew admitting that he had spoken with the girls would cast suspicion on him, but he couldn't take the risk of lying that he hadn't seen them. It was a public place. Somebody could easily have spotted him chatting to them. If he got caught lying, it would have been all over. The next day, he got to work cleaning the car. He got the tyres changed and removed the carpet from the car boot. He called Maxine and begged her to come home early from her trip, saying he needed her to lie for him, as the girls had come by the house and he would be the prime suspect if she didn't give him an alibi. He then started asking questions of police officers about DNA evidence and how long it lasted, which put him straight under suspicion. He became paranoid when he learnt the DNA evidence could last a very long time, so he went back to Lakenheath and set Holly and Jessica on fire. He then embraced his role as searcher. He played a keen part in the search and was often seen as being the unofficial leader of a lot of the search parties that were organised. And Maxine was only too happy to help, lying for Ian and giving him his alibi. The families, the community, the entire country, even parts of the world were stricken with grief at the news Holly and Jessica had been found dead. That grief soon turned to anger. Police had to keep the location of Ian and Maxine secret as vigilante attacks were a legitimate fear. At Maxine's first court appearance, her prison van was pelted with objects. There was a large crowd yelling abuse and threats, and they were banging on the side of the van as it went past. And whilst Maxine was at her first court appearance, Ian was in a mental health ward pretending to be crazy. His every move was watched and recorded for 50 days in the hospital. Extensive notes were kept, and doctors concluded his mental illness was all a sham. Ian was putting on an act and should be treated like every other suspect. They recommended he be sent back to normal custody. He was taken to prison and was met by a huge amount of abuse and threats from the other inmates. He was placed in a specially made, isolated cell where he was kept under close watch, but he still managed a near-successful suicide attempt. He had to have an urgent stomach pump, but he survived. Maxine was also segregated from other prisoners. She tried to starve herself, and at one point she had to be force-fed through a tube to stay alive. By the time the trial came around, more forensic evidence had come to light. Police had found fibres from the Manchester United jerseys in Huntley's home. They found evidence in his car, plus they had his prints on the bag the girls' jerseys were found in. Maxine and Ian were tried together in the same courtroom. Faced with the overwhelming physical evidence, Ian was forced to come up with a story. He admitted the girls were in his house. He said Holly's nose started to bleed, so they walked upstairs to the bath, which was full of water, as he had been washing the dog. Holly sat on the side of the tub and he accidentally bumped into her, causing her to fall and hit her head. Jessica started screaming, "You pushed her," so he rushed over to try and quieten her down by grabbing her around the mouth, accidentally killing her in the process. He then turned around to find Holly had drowned by accident. Huntley took the stand to give this ridiculous account, and the many gaping holes in his story were easily exposed. Ian also testified Maxine didn't know that he was responsible for the girl's death, and when Maxine testified the next day, she said Ian's testimony was the first time he said he was responsible for their death. Until that point, she believed he was innocent. But many remain unconvinced. Her explanation for doing several extremely detailed house cleans was that she was a clean freak, and I'm not sure what the reason was that she gave for repeatedly referring to the girls in the past tense. She said Ian begged her to lie for him and provide an alibi, as police would think it was him even though he didn't do it. She said she knew it wasn't right morally, but she thought it was right for Ian, as she didn't want him to be accused of something he hadn't done. There was evidence Ian had been frantically trying to clean the house when Maxine arrived home from Grimsby, but she said she believed this was done to try and cover up the fact that he had been cheating on her. She made herself out to be a victim of Ian as well, an unwilling pawn.
Who can forget the very dramatic scenes in courtroom number 1 as Maxine Carr, giving her evidence from the witness box, broke down as she was questioned and said, pointing at Ian Huntley across the courtroom, "I will not be blamed for what that thing in that box has done to me or those children."
Ian Huntley was found guilty of murder. He was given a life sentence for each count and was given a minimum term of 40 years. Meaning he would be eligible for release in 2042, at 68 years of age. Interestingly, the jury wasn't unanimous. It was an 11-1 count. Maxine Carr was found guilty of providing a false alibi, but not guilty of helping conceal the murder. The jury was satisfied she didn't know Ian had killed Jessica and Holly. Maxine was sentenced to 3.5 years jail, but she only served 1 year and 9 months. When released from prison, Maxine was given a new identity. Her appearance was changed with the help of experts, and she was placed in a secret location to live. Her lawyers successfully got a High Court injunction banning the press from revealing her new identity or the location she lived. It basically forbade journalists from even trying to find out this information, let alone publish it. She was even given police guards to protect against revenge attacks. And of course, all this was done at the expense of the taxpayer.